From being biased but respectful toward UFC fighters, to pretending like an opponent has a fighting chance. This is Joe Rogan's UFC bias finally exposed. Starting with an episode from the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. During one of the many episodes of his podcast, he and Brian Simpson discussed various topics, and the comedian eventually asked him about how he handles criticism regarding his biased commentary. He responded by saying that he's committed to being fair in his commentary, out of respect for the sport. He also acknowledged that while some may think of him as being biased, they wouldn't find him being disrespectful unless someone's actions asked for it. That might sound like he's being wrongfully accused. But then, why did he and Cormier get criticized at UFC 259? Rogan began his journey with the UFC in 1997 and established himself as a prominent figure in the early 2000s. Throughout the years, he's faced criticism for his work on several occasions. Certain members of the MMA community have accused him of favoring specific fighters, alleging his infamously biased commentary. One incident occurred during the Jan Blachowicz vs. Israel Adesanya fight at UFC 259. Blachowicz defeated Adesanya via unanimous decision over 5 rounds. But many people in the MMA community, including UFC stars like Martin Vettori and Justin Gaethje, criticized Rogan and Cormier. Their commentary portrayed Adesanya as the superior fighter, despite his rival's clear victory. This wasn't the only time something like this happened. There were other instances where his bias was on full display. Mike Goldberg has a distinct voice and always asks relevant questions, which are important when it comes to MMA commentary. On the other hand, Rogan knows more when it comes to ground games and jiu-jitsu. But what about stand-up in the clinch? He assumes the role of expert and primarily focuses on the ground game. During stand-up exchanges, he displays limited in-depth knowledge, or fails to express it. A keen observer of striking, for example, would talk about the direction in which a fighter is circling. Are they moving away from the opponent's power hand? Are they unintentionally putting themselves in danger? Instead, we often hear Goldberg say, "Nice right hand by XYZ," to which Rogan usually replies with a, "He is so powerful." There are instances where he talks about irrelevant things during all the action. He's a great commentator who brings some personality to the events, but including an expert in the striking game or overall MMA would help counterbalance any of his biases. Speaking of which, UFC 287 generated a lot of controversy as fans accused him of being biased. Jorge Masvidal faced Gilbert Burns in the co-main event, promising an exciting slugfest. The fight lived up to expectations, with Gamebred attempting to please his home crowd despite being outclassed by Durinho. Burns dominated Masvidal throughout the fight, but after the third round, Rogan described it as an even round. Of course, that comment didn't sit well with the Twitterazzi. User Spinnin' Backfist was left in disbelief, asking if he really said that. Fans seemed to agree that there was something off about his commentary. One user commented that the "oh no" before the last takedown was suspicious. Another user suggested that Joe Rogan was under the influence of DMT. One user attempted to defend him by pointing out Masvidal's performance, especially all the strikes he connected, and how he did far better than most expected against absolutely top-tier competition. So maybe it makes sense for him to be focused on that. Burns beat him fair and square, but Jorge went out on a great note, thanks to the commentator. But then again, commentating requires a very delicate balance. His role as a UFC commentator requires him to analyze fights honestly and objectively. He's also friends with many fighters, which means he needs to balance his impartiality with his desire to see his friends succeed. He's admitted that there are certain fighters who make it challenging for him to hide his bias when they compete. This happened during a conversation with UFC lightweight Donald Cerrone on his podcast, and it had to do with Ronda Rousey, who's a close friend of his. He said he has a bias towards Cerrone too. He tries to suppress it, but being a commentator is tough when there are fighters he loves. The thing is, he needs to strive for objectivity, but he also has to be honest if something is happening. And for some fighters, it's difficult for him. Conor McGregor has accused Rogan in the past of favoring fighters from Team Alpha Male, and it seems like his comments support that claim. So ultimately, he's biased toward a lot of guys. But when they're fighting, he tries his best to let his love for them slide, and tries to look at fights as objectively as possible. Of course, that doesn't come easy, and his bias shines through every time. Even Tony Ferguson thinks so. It's one of the reasons he's never appeared on his podcast. Following his loss to Michael Chandler at UFC 274, he didn't hesitate to talk about his thoughts on the current state of affairs in the UFC, especially the commentary. During a recent appearance on the MMA Hour, El Kukui vented about the commentary team slinging out certain fighters and ganging up on them during fights. He thinks that what ends up happening is when the commentators gang up on people that they don't like, it's safe to say that he might as well be the only fighter who's declined an offer to appear on his podcast. He's also made it clear that he would never participate in a Zoom or anything related to Rogan. Part of the reason on top of his bias is the fact that he believes in his values and insists on being compensated for such interviews. Tony even doubled down on his comments during the MMA Hour, with some tweets in response to a fan wondering why Rogan was on Ferguson's hit list. Well, he reiterated that the podcast host is a sensitive one, and acknowledged that he may consider accepting an invitation someday if he gets an apology from him. He's had a problem with Uncle Joe's commentary since UFC 256, and who can blame him? The commentary on his fight against Charles Oliveira affected him, but thankfully, his fans watched the fight without the commentary to form their own opinion. Of course, that doesn't mean that the issue of biased commentary in the UFC isn't a big deal. It's been a hot topic among fans, fighters, and analysts for a long time now. It's not limited to Joe Rogan alone, but his name often comes up due to his role as a very popular commentator and his long association with the sport. Needless to say, in this day and age, it's hard to hide anything. Fans have noticed instances where his commentary appears to be in favor of certain fighters over others. He even overlooks game-changing aspects of some fights. One common criticism is, of course, his focus on the ground game and lack of in-depth analysis during stand-up and clinch situations. He does know a lot about MMA, and specifically jiu-jitsu, but some fans can't help but feel that his expertise in striking is comparatively limited. Who can argue that a striking expert or an all-around MMA analyst would bring a more balanced perspective to the commentary team and help offset any perceived bias? At some point, Joe Rogan needs to understand one thing. The UFC needs comprehensive analysis to capture the full spectrum of action inside the octagon. He faced backlash for his commentary during UFC 277 as well, particularly in the main event between Amanda Nunes and Juliana Pena, when Nunes dominated the fight and caused a lot of damage to her opponent. But despite all that, Rogan and his fellow commentator Daniel Cormier were making it seem more competitive than it was. Of course, fans were having none of it, and pointed out how hard they were trying to portray it as a close fight, even though it was heavily one-sided in Nunes' favor. So, by incorporating different perspectives into the commentary team, the UFC can probably help with all the backlash he's been receiving. Not only that, it could give us fans a better and more objective viewing experience. Sure, criticism of biased commentary isn't unique to Joe Rogan or the UFC. Commentators in many sports have faced similar accusations over the years. But ultimately, the responsibility lies with the UFC to address these concerns and ensure the commentary remains unbiased. So, from making it seem like Juliana Pena had a fighting chance at UFC 277, to being both biased and respectful during his commentary, this was Joe Rogan's UFC bias finally exposed.